12th of April 1943. Rastenburg, East Prussia. German staff officers received operational papers marked Geheime Kommandosache, outlining a planned summer offensive against the Soviet salient at Kursk. Weather records from the Oberkommando des Heeres meteorological section confirmed slow spring thaw and heavy ground saturation. Initial planners estimated a breakthrough window of 14 days, assuming coordination between Army Group South and Army Group Center would achieve decisive penetration before Soviet reserves could react. Reality, as documented in subsequent operational summaries, would prove different. By mid-April, Soviet Stavka decrypts collected in the TsAMO RF archive show that Soviet intelligence already recorded the likely German strike window. Aerial reconnaissance prints measured rail line capacity. Production figures for the Panzerkampfwagen Siegfried, Tiger and Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther appeared in staff assessments. For those studying the maps that spring, it became the earliest sign that the front was shifting from maneuver to mathematics. The headquarters at Rastenburg sat deep in East Prussian pine forest, its concrete bunkers connected by narrow pathways. On 12th of April 1943, field commanders gathered in briefing rooms where topographic maps covered entire walls. The Kursk salient, a Soviet bulge extending westward between Orel and Belgorod, measured roughly 200 kilometers wide and 150 kilometers deep. German reconnaissance flights photographed trench systems, rail junctions and artillery concentrations across the zone. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, reviewed production schedules for the Panther tank. Heereswaffen-Amt logs confirmed that by late June, monthly Panther output would reach 250 units. The Tiger Y, already proven in combat, numbered 81 available across key sectors. General Walther Model, commanding Army Group Center, requested additional assault gun battalions to support the 9th Army's northern thrust. Soviet intelligence intercepts, later declassified, revealed that by 15th April, Stavka had identified German concentrations near Orel and Kharkov. Marshal Georgy Zhukov forwarded assessments to Joseph Stalin, noting the likelihood of a pincer attack converging on Kursk. Soviet transport records document the immediate response. Over 1,300 kilometers of dedicated rail movement, bringing reserves to the threatened sector. In a bunker near Sverdlovsk, Private Ivan Karpov, 31st Tank Brigade mechanic, maintained a T-34 model 1942. His hands, cracked from cold and work, scraped frozen grease from track links using a pocket knife. Unit medical registers note a persistent cough. On 4th May 1943, he wrote in his diary, "Mud takes strength, we clean tracks until fingers numb." A miner's son, he had received no mail in 2 months. When a letter finally arrived, it reported his wife's concern over their child's fever. He folded the page carefully and placed it in his breast pocket, returning to work as the diesel engine coughed to life. Behind the statistics, 2,000 German tanks mobilized between March and April, 2,500 Soviet trains dispatched, were hands tightening bolts, eyes straining over maps, breath visible in cold dawn air. German planners believed speed and firepower could achieve local superiority before Soviet depth could respond. Soviet files show preparation for sustained attrition, trading space for time, while reserves assembled. For analysts reviewing the records decades later, the episode demonstrated that wars begin with mathematics long before fire opens. Weather logs recorded mud, transport manifests listed tonnage, and intelligence summaries tracked movements. As April turned to May, both sides understood the collision was inevitable. The question was not whether, but when and at what cost. Between 1st May and 30th June 1943, Soviet engineers excavated over 5,000 kilometers of trenches across the Kursk salient. NKVD front zone reports document 400,000 mines laid, 300 kilometers of anti-tank ditches dug, and over 600 kilometers of barbed wire strung. Rokossovsky's Central Front Weather Diary notes dry winds, carrying dust by late May, temperatures rising, and ground hardening. Soviet Central and Voronezh fronts received reinforcements, 6 tank armies, 10 artillery divisions, and over 20,000 trucks. NKPS Rail Ministry logs show over 1,500 trains dispatched between April and June. Factories at Nizhny Tagil and Chelyabinsk recorded 2,305 T-34s produced in the same period. Each tank required 40 hours of final assembly, 200 litres of fuel for transport, and a crew trained over 6 weeks. German quartermaster logs from Army Group South record fuel ration shortfalls by 7 to 12% in early June. Luftwaffe 8, Flieger Corps, mission logs note increasing Soviet anti-aircraft fire during reconnaissance flights. Declassified ultra-intercept summaries confirm British analysts observed large German tank movements but avoided direct revelation to protect source integrity. Sergeant Maria Smirnova, 87th Anti-Aircraft Regiment, operated a 37mm M1939 61K gun near Poniri. A teacher from Tula, she had volunteered in 1941. Regimental medical logs note blistered palms from digging gun positions. On 20th of May, she wrote, "We dig positions until nails bleed. Nights cold. Tools heavy." Her section received a ration of dried fish, a rare supplement. She shared half with a younger recruit, a girl from Leningrad, who had lost her family during the siege. Dust hung in the air, throats stayed dry, and wind remained steady across the open steppe. German Eskisov 8th Panzer Corps received new Panther tanks in early June. Crews trained on gunnery ranges near Kharkov, familiarizing themselves with the 75mm KWK-42 L-70 gun. Technical reports noted transmission, overheating, and final drive failures during extended movement. 2 SS Panzer Corps, comprising Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, concentrated south of Belgorod, conducting live fire exercises and maintenance checks. Planners on both sides noted the unprecedented scale. For the Soviets, it represented the largest defensive preparation in their history. For the Germans, it signaled the commitment of strategic reserves, with no operational margin for failure. As intelligence accumulated, both staffs recognized that the outcome would depend not on tactical brilliance, but on industrial output, logistical endurance, and the willingness of soldiers to endure what the plans demanded. The lines were drawn, the mines were set, both armies waited for dry ground. 5 July 1943, 0220, Kursk Front, Orel-Belgorod axis. Soviet artillery opened with approximately 3,000 guns across the salient, confirmed in Voronezh Front Fire Plan 0066 OP. The barrage targeted German assembly areas identified through reconnaissance and intelligence intercepts. German infantry logs from the 332nd Infantry Division recorded heavy fire, continuous vibration in dugouts, smell of cordite. At 03:00, German forces launched their offensive. Luftwaffe 8 Flieger Corps sortie reports show 1,120 missions flown on the opening day. Soviet Second Air Army logged 3,385 sorties in response. Radio intercepts documented fuel strain at German forward airfields by evening. Ground fog lifted by 05:30, revealing dust clouds from advancing tank columns. Gefreiter Karl Hoffmann, 332nd Infantry Division, waited in a tree line south of Belgorod. A baker's son from Bavaria, he had been conscripted in 1941. His section carried an MG-42 machine gun. Hoffmann served as assistant gunner, responsible for ammunition belts and barrel changes. In a field letter dated 6th July, he wrote, "Ground shakes, mouth dry, boots damp from dew." His friend, a clerk from Munich, was wounded by shell fragmentation before noon. Hoffmann's hands froze as he attempted to apply a dressing, blood soaking through the cloth. The smell of oil, earth and burned propellant filled the air. Medical evacuation took 4 hours. The clerk survived, but lost use of his left arm. Tiger tanks from the 505th Heavy Panzer Battalion advanced towards Soviet positions near Cherkasskoye. Soviet 6th Guards Army anti-tank guns, primarily 76mm ZS-3 models, engaged at ranges between 800 and wide 200 meters. German after-action reports note that Tigers absorbed multiple hits without penetration, but track damage from mines reduced mobility. One Tiger crew abandoned their vehicle after striking 3 mines in succession, the suspension collapsing under repeated detonations. Soviet forward observers recorded German infantry moving behind armor, taking cover in shell craters and irrigation ditches. Artillery fire shifted to interdict German supply columns, targeting fuel trucks and ammunition carriers. By evening, both sides reported casualties in the thousands, with German advances measured in single-digit kilometers. Both command staffs recognized the opening as a test of endurance, not maneuver. The ground absorbed men, metal, and time. Reports flowed to headquarters through radio nets and dispatch riders, each message adding to the accumulating picture of attritional struggle. The battle had begun as planned. The cost had already exceeded estimates. Between 6th and 8th July, fighting centered on Ponyri Station, a railway junction on the northern shoulder of the salient. German 9th Army staff journals document repeated assaults stalled by minefields and concentrated anti-tank fire. Soviet 13th Army deployed PTRD-41 anti-tank rifles in concealed positions, targeting tracks, optics, and engine grills at close range. Temperature rose to 27 degrees by midday on 7th July. Dust from vehicle movement reduced visibility to 200 meters in some sectors. German 653rd Heavy Panzerjäger Battalion deployed Ferdinand tank destroyers, 65-ton vehicles mounting an 88mm Paquet 4032 L-71 gun. Soviet reports describe Ferdinands as nearly immune to frontal fire, but vulnerable to flank attacks and Molotov cocktails when infantry closed within throwing distance. By 8th July, German 9th Army recorded approximately 15% operational tank losses due to mechanical failure, mine damage, and combat attrition. Soviet 307th Rifle Division reported ammunition shortages and exhausted logistics horses. Water resupply became irregular. Medics treated dehydration cases alongside combat wounds. Lieutenant Ivan Karpov reappears in unit records on 7th July. Medical entries note bloodshot eyes and fatigue tremors. His T-34's radiator clogged with dust. The crew wiped air filters using torn shirt cloth and rags scavenged from abandoned positions. In his diary, dated 8th July, engine knocks, hands shake after hours in turret, one crewman silent after blast. The crewman, a loader from Kharkov, had been concussed by a near miss from an 88mm round. He sat motionless for 20 minutes before speaking again. Karpov held a family photo near the radio set during brief pauses in shelling. The image creased and stained. Soviet anti-tank belts proved effective. German breakthrough pace fell below planned rates. Model's 9th Army, tasked with reaching Kursk within 4 days, had advanced less than 10 kilometers by 8th July. Soviet reserves moved into blocking positions, supported by continuous artillery fire directed from observation posts in church towers and grain elevators. German fuel consumption exceeded forecasts. Panzer divisions reported supply delays due to damaged roads and partisan attacks on rear area convoys. Luftwaffe air superiority, assumed in pre-operation planning, failed to materialize. Soviet fighters contested German strikes, and anti-aircraft fire forced bombers to higher, less accurate altitudes. Attrition mounted on both sides. As focus shifted to the southern axis, where Taos SS Panzer Corps sought breakthrough toward Oboyan, the northern assault ground to a halt among minefields, rubble, and exhausted infantry. The record showed what planners had feared: depth, not maneuver, would decide the outcome. 9 to 10th of July 1943. Belgorod-Oboyan axis. 2. SS Panzer Corps advanced through collective farm belts south of Kursk. Luftwaffe reconnaissance film captured dust clouds rising from armoured columns. Visibility degraded to 150 metres in some sectors. Temperature reached 29 degrees on 10th of July. Soviet sapper diaries confirm mine belts breached under fire, with engineers clearing paths under direct observation from German tanks. German fuel consumption reports documented usage exceeding forecasts by 22% due to cross-country movement and repeated repositioning. Soviet 1st Tank Army repositioned to block the advance. 5th Guards Tank Army, held in reserve near Prokhorovka, redeployed 230 kilometers in 36 hours via rail and road march. SS Panzer Grenadier Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler spearheaded the southern thrust. Reports describe combined arms tactics, Panthers providing overwatch while infantry cleared villages and strongpoints. Soviet 1st Tank Army engaged at ranges between 600 and 1,500 meters, accepting losses to delay German momentum. Obergefreiter Hans Reiser, Panther crewman with Leibstandarte, served as loader. A mechanic from Hamburg, he had trained on the Panther AUSF 3D for 3 weeks before deployment. Unit technical logs document gearbox overheating issues and final drive failures requiring field repairs. In a letter dated 11th of July, Reiser wrote, "Loader exhausted, sweat in eyes, powder smell constant. During engagement on 10th of July, his Panther's turret traverse mechanism jammed momentarily due to dust intrusion. The crew cleared the fault using compressed air and manual rotation, but the incident left Reiser shaken. After-action comments note fear of immobilization under fire. Soviet artillery shifted to counter-battery fire, targeting German gun positions identified through sound ranging and air observation. German records report ammunition expenditure rates 30% above planned, straining supply lines already stretched by distance and poor road conditions. Both armies reached the limits of immediate supply. German spearheads advanced 30 kilometers in 5 days, significant by Eastern Front standards, but below the tempo required for operational breakthrough. Soviet reserves continued arriving. Fresh rifle divisions, artillery regiments, and tank brigades drawn from strategic depth. Tank reliability tested under continuous operation. German maintenance crews worked through nights replacing track links, repairing transmissions, and refueling under blackout conditions. Soviet repair brigades cannibalized damaged vehicles for parts, prioritizing operational readiness over total numbers. As armor concentrated near Prokhorovka, commanders on both sides prepared for decisive engagement. The maps showed convergence, the logistics showed strain. The outcome would depend on who could sustain combat power longer. The decisive moment approached. 12th of July 1943, 06:30, Prokhorovka. Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov, launched a counterattack against the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. Operational records document approximately 300 Soviet tanks engaging roughly 200 German tanks and assault guns across open terrain intersected by a railway embankment and shallow ravines. Dust, smoke, and engine noise dominated the sensory environment. Tank commanders reported visibility reduced to 50 meters in some sectors. Soviet T-34s closed range rapidly to negate the Panther's superior gun, engaging at 300-500 meters where armor penetration became mutual. German reports describe confused fighting with frequent flank exposures and difficulty maintaining formation. Soviet tank losses reached approximately 300 vehicles by day's end. Archival estimates vary between 252 and 334 depending on classification of damaged versus destroyed. German operational losses numbered fewer, with many damaged vehicles recovered and repaired. However, the tactical objective, halting the German advance, succeeded. 2 SS Panzer Corps withdrew to defensive positions, ending the southern thrust toward Kursk. Lieutenant Ivan Karpov's T-34 took a hit to the turret ring at approximately 09:15. The impact destroyed the radio and concussed the crew. Medical notes document ringing ears and disorientation. He wrote later, "Engine smoke thick, friends silent in turret, breath tastes like metal." The gunner, a factory worker from Chelyabinsk, suffered a fractured collarbone from the impact. The crew evacuated the vehicle under covering fire from adjacent tanks, crawling through dust and spent shell casings to reach Soviet lines. Karpov's hands shook as he helped drag the wounded gunner to a medical station. German crews reported fuel and ammunition shortages by afternoon. Resupply columns struggled to reach forward positions due to Soviet artillery interdiction and air attacks. Panther reliability issues persisted. Approximately 40% of Panthers engaged at Prokhorovka experienced mechanical failures requiring field repair or recovery. Soviet losses, while heavy, represented acceptable attrition within the context of defensive strategy. Reserves remained available. German reserves had been committed. The initiative sought by German planners since April remained elusive. As news of the engagement reached headquarters, both staffs recognized the strategic implications. German offensive momentum had stalled across both axes. Soviet defensive depth had absorbed the assault. The mathematics of attrition favored the side with greater industrial output and logistical resilience. The turning point had arrived, recorded not in dramatic breakthrough but in the quiet accumulation of losses that could not be replaced. 15-30 July 1943. Chelyabinsk Tractor Plant, Soviet Union, Kog, Ruhr region, Germany. While fighting continued at Kursk, industrial output shaped the battlefield's future balance. Factory logs from Chelyabinsk recorded production of 34 T-34 tank per day during July. Workers operated in 12-hour shifts. Sparks from welding illuminated assembly floors where women comprised over 60% of the workforce. Elena Morozova, age 19, worked as a welder on T-34 hull sections. A machinist's daughter from Magnitogorsk. She had volunteered for factory work in 1942. In a letter to her brother, serving with a rifle regiment near Bryansk, dated 22nd of July, she wrote, "Hands cut on steel, nights loud, we weld without rest." Her brother's reply never reached her. He was listed as missing in action on 18th of July during reconnaissance near Orel. The notification arrived 3 weeks later. She continued working, wiping sweat with her sleeve as sparks burned small holes in her uniform. Soviet Rail Ministry shipment records document 15,000 tons of ammunition delivered to Central Front between 15 and 30 July. Transport prioritized artillery shells, anti-tank rounds, and fuel. Locomotives operated under blackout conditions. Maintenance crews repaired track damage from partisan activity and occasional Luftwaffe bombing. In the German Ruhr region, Allied bombing raids disrupted steel production and component manufacturing. German Armaments Ministry reports note decreasing monthly output of heavy tanks and assault guns. Panther readiness rates fell to 37% by mid-July due to spare parts, shortages, and inadequate field repair capacity. The contrast revealed itself in the numbers. Soviet industrial output sustained losses and rebuilt strength. German output struggled to replace attrition. The arithmetic of war shifted measurably during July 1943. Factory workers saw none of the battlefield but carried its weight. Morozova's hands bore scars from steel edges and welding burns. She slept in factory dormitories where letters from the front arrived irregularly, each envelope a moment of hope or dread. Her brother's photograph remained taped above her bunk until war's end. Industrial resilience shaped battlefield endurance more than any single engagement. The tanks rolling from Chelyabinsk, the shells loaded onto trains, the fuel transported under cover of darkness. Each represented choices made far from the front by people whose names appear in production ledgers rather than military honors. As factories worked, Soviet armies prepared to seize initiative. The defensive phase had succeeded. The counteroffensive phase awaited the moment when logistics permitted sustained advance. The records documented preparation, not celebration. The work continued. 3 to 12 August 1943. Orel-Belgorod offensives. Soviet forces launched Operation Kutuzov against the Orel salient and Operation Rumyantsev toward Belgorod and Kharkov. Red Army daily operational summaries record artillery densities reaching 200 guns per kilometer on breakthrough sectors. German defensive responses, characterized in Wehrmacht reports as elastic withdrawals, sought to preserve forces while trading space. Soviet artillery preparation began at 06 Ugern on 3 August, targeting German defensive positions, command posts, and logistics nodes. Luftwaffe fuel records show severe shortages, limiting defensive air support. Soviet Second Air Army flew over 3,000 sorties on opening day, achieving effective air superiority over most sectors. Gefreiter Karl Hoffmann, wounded during fighting near Poniri in mid-July, evacuated to a field hospital near Orel. Medical records document shrapnel wounds to left leg and shoulder. In a letter fragment dated 7th August, he wrote, "Field hospital cold, bandages stiff." A nurse from Breslau applied iodine to prevent infection. He watched stretcher lines grow as the Soviet offensive pushed German forces westward. The hospital evacuated on 9th August as Soviet tanks approached. Hoffmann travelled by truck convoy toward Bryansk, the vehicle jolting over damaged roads. Soviet forces liberated Orel on 5 August and Belgorod on the same day. Red Army soldiers entered towns finding rubble, burned buildings and exhausted civilians. NKVD reports document evidence of German demolitions targeting infrastructure and industrial facilities. Lieutenant Karpov returned to his unit on 10th August after brief hospitalization for concussion symptoms. Medical notes record persistent hand tremor and tinnitus. His T-34, damaged at Prokhorovka, had been repaired using salvaged parts from destroyed vehicles. The crew welcomed him quietly. The replacement loader, a teenager from Voronezh, had been killed by artillery fire during the Orel offensive. Soviet casualty records for August indicate heavy losses at river crossing sites and fortified positions. Rifle divisions reported 30–40% casualties during breakthrough operations. German casualty and loss records show similar attrition rates, but with less capacity for replacement. By 12th August, Soviet forces had advanced 100,000 to 150 kilometers along multiple axes. German armor strength fell below 50% of pre-Kursk levels. The strategic reserve committed in July had been expended. No comparable force remained available. Momentum proved irreversible. What began as German offensive transformed into sustained Soviet advance. The mathematics of replacement capacity dictated outcomes. Soviet factories outproduced German industry. Soviet manpower reserves exceeded German availability. The campaign shifted from defense to pursuit. The front rolled westward. 23rd August 1943. Kharkov. Soviet forces recaptured the city after 3 days of urban combat. Voronezh Front War Diary notes, Kharkov liberated, streets rubble. Civilian population emerged slowly. German withdrawal orders, issued on 22nd August, prioritized salvaging heavy equipment and establishing defensive positions along the Dnieper River. Dust and smoke hung over collapsed buildings. The smell of burning persisted days after fighting ceased. Soviet engineers began clearing rubble and restoring minimal services. Civilians, many having survived German occupation since October 1941, faced shortages of food, water, and shelter. Red Cross reports document typhus outbreaks and malnutrition. German armoured forces withdrew in relatively good order despite equipment losses. Panzer divisions retained organisational structure but operated at 40–50% authorised strength. Luftwaffe units redeployed westward, abandoning forward airfields as Soviet mechanised units advanced. Lieutenant Ivan Karpov's tank entered Kharkov outskirts on 24th August. His diary entry, dated 25th August, reads, "Silence after months of noise. I think of home." He touched the photograph in his breast pocket. Wife and child, taken in 1940. The tank's engine cooled with metallic ticking sounds. Around him, soldiers rested briefly before receiving orders to continue westward. Some lit cigarettes, others checked equipment or wrote letters. Sergeant Maria Smirnova's anti-aircraft battery participated in the liberation. Her unit diary records relief, mixed with fatigue. "We fired less each day as Luftwaffe withdrew. Hands steadier now." She survived the war, returning to teaching in Tula in 1946. Soviet casualty figures for the Kursk campaign, including defensive and offensive phases, totaled approximately 860,000 personnel, killed, wounded, and missing. German casualties exceeded 200,000. Tank losses on both sides numbered in thousands. Exact figures remain debated due to varying definitions of total loss versus repairable damage. Strategic consequences proved decisive. Germany lost offensive capability on the Eastern Front. Thereafter, Wehrmacht operations remained predominantly defensive. Soviet forces gained initiative they would maintain through 1945. Industrial output, logistical depth, and manpower reserves determined outcomes more than tactical innovation. For participants, the campaign represented endurance rather than glory. Karpov survived the war, returning to mining work in the Urals. His diary, preserved by family, contains no heroic declarations, only observations of cold, fatigue, and the faces of men who did not return. The front rolled west. Planners prepared for the long advance toward the Dnieper and beyond. The operational files for Kursk close with statistics rather than commentary. Soviet forces advanced approximately 140 kilometers by early September 1943, liberating over 13,000 square kilometers of territory. German defensive lines contracted toward the Dnieper, requiring abandonment of forward supply bases and fortified positions constructed over previous months. Industrial production data documents the war's deeper logic. Between July and December 1943, Soviet factories produced over 8,500 T-34 tanks. German production totaled approximately 2,800 Panther and Tiger tanks combined during the same period. The ratio reflected not only raw output, but also prioritization of resources, availability of materials, and effectiveness of industrial organization under wartime conditions. The human cost persisted beyond battlefield casualties. families received telegrams listing sons, husbands and fathers as killed or missing. Soviet orphanages registered thousands of children who had lost parents during 1943. German hospitals treated amputees, burn victims, and soldiers suffering psychological trauma from sustained combat. For military analysts, Kursk confirmed principles observable throughout the war, that logistics shape possibilities, that industrial capacity determines sustainability, and that defensive depth absorbs offensive momentum when properly prepared. The Soviet decision to await German attack, fortify comprehensively, and counterattack with accumulated reserves proved strategically sound. Lieutenant Karpov continued serving through the war's end, participating in offensives through Ukraine, Poland, and into Germany. His final diary entry, dated 10th of May 1945, notes, "The guns stopped. We sit in silence. Some cry, I think only of return. He survived, but the tremor in his hands never fully resolved. Post-war medical records list combat stress syndrome, a term inadequate for years of accumulated exposure to violence, loss, and fear. The maps remained in archives, trench lines, mine belts, advance arrows, casualty figures. Each mark represented decisions made under pressure, lives expended for objectives measured in kilometers, and the accumulated weight of industrial warfare's logic. For those who study the records today, the lesson emerges quietly, that war is decided not by decisive moments alone, but by the capacity to endure, replace losses, and sustain operations beyond the enemy's ability to respond. That capacity in 1943 rested with the Soviet Union's industrial base, transportation network, and population's willingness to bear the burden. The file closes without dramatic conclusion. The numbers speak. The next page begins preparations for crossing the Dnieper. The war continued. In 1963, 20 years after Kursk, Soviet veterans gathered at Prokhorovka for memorial dedication. Photographs show older men in civilian clothes, medals worn over jackets, standing before a monument marking the battlefield. Some wept, others stood silently. No speeches claimed glory, only acknowledgement of cost and memory of absent comrades. Ivan Karpov attended. His daughter, born in 1946, accompanied him. She later recalled he said little during the ceremony, standing apart from the crowd, hands folded. He had rarely discussed the war at home, answering questions briefly and changing subjects. The tremor in his hands remained. He blamed it on age when asked. German veterans, by contrast, rarely gathered publicly to commemorate Kursk. The defeat represented a turning point too painful to celebrate, a moment when the initiative passed irreversibly. Some wrote memoirs. Most remained silent. Hans Reiser, the Panther loader, returned to Hamburg after capture in 1944, resuming work as a mechanic. He died in 1982. His family found his wartime letters only during a state settlement. Historians analyzing Kursk focus on measurable factors, tank numbers, production rates, logistics capacity, artillery densities. These metrics reveal the operation's material logic, yet the human dimension resists quantification. The fatigue, fear, and endurance of participants who rarely articulated their experiences in ways archives preserve. Maria Smirnova, the anti-aircraft sergeant, taught mathematics in Tula until retirement in 1975. She never married. Students remembered her as stern but fair. A photograph from 1970 shows her at a veterans meeting wearing her medals, expression neutral. She declined interview requests, stating only, "We did our duty. That is enough." The battlefield itself became farmland again. Plough blades occasionally unearthed shell fragments, spent cartridges and rusted metal. Local museums display artifacts. helmets, canteens, identity tags. Each item represents a person whose name may or may not appear in records, whose story ended in soil that now grows wheat. For those seeking meaning in Kursk, the records offer no single interpretation. The battle demonstrated industrial warfare's logic, the effectiveness of defensive preparation, and the cost of strategic miscalculation. It showed that wars are won through sustained capacity, not decisive brilliance, and it revealed what participants knew but rarely stated, that victory and defeat are abstractions measured by historians, while those who fought experienced only survival, loss, and the slow return to ordinary life, if they returned at all. The memorial at Prokhorovka stands today. Names cover its surfaces. The list is long, the silence endures. The archival files for Operation Citadel, the German codename for Kursk, occupy meters of shelf space across multiple repositories. Operational orders, intelligence summaries, logistics reports, casualty lists, and equipment status updates document every phase. Reading them conveys not drama but routine. Staff officers recording numbers, commanders requesting resources, units reporting positions. One statistic captures the campaign's essence. Between 5 July and 23 August 1943, Soviet forces suffered approximately 860,000 casualties, yet maintained continuous offensive capability through September. German forces, losing approximately 200,000 Hollands, could not replace losses or sustain operations. The difference reflected industrial capacity, population reserves, and transportation infrastructure, unglamorous factors that determined outcomes. Soviet tank production during 1943 totaled approximately 24,000 units. German production reached roughly 10,000 armoured fighting vehicles of all types. The ratio, nearly 2.41, represented steel tonnage, factory organisation, labour mobilisation, and resource allocation. Each tank required thousands of components, hundreds of workers, and complex logistics chains. Soviet success in maintaining production, despite German advances earlier in the war, demonstrated organizational resilience. Historians continue studying. For families, the statistics meant telegrams. Soviet losses of 860,000 during Kursk represent fathers, sons, brothers. German losses of 200,000 represent the same. Neither side's grief exceeded the other's. Both endured what war demanded. The distinction lay not in suffering, but in capacity to continue despite it. Karpov's diary, preserved by his family and donated to a regional museum in 1998, contains 47 entries from 1943. Most describe routine, maintenance tasks, weather conditions, ration quality. Only 3 mention combat directly. The final entry from 1943, dated 30th of December, reads, "Year ends. Many gone. I remain. Do not know why." This uncertainty, why survival fell to some and not others, appears frequently in veteran accounts. No satisfying answer emerges from records. Chance, positioning, timing, and luck determined outcomes. Individual skill could not control. The legacy of Kursk resides not in triumphant narratives, but in recognition of what industrial warfare costs and how nations endure it. The Soviet Union absorbed losses that would have destroyed smaller powers, sustaining operations through depth and resilience. Germany, despite tactical skill and technological innovation, quit the industrial base to replace attrition. For contemporary observers, the lesson remains relevant. That capacity, endurance, and willingness to bear costs determine outcomes in sustained conflict. That victory emerges not from brilliance, but from the unglamorous work of production, transportation, and administration. The files remain available for research. The numbers await interpretation. The names on memorials deserve remembrance. The war continued beyond Kursk, westward through Ukraine, Poland, and into Germany itself, but the trajectory established in summer 1943 never reversed. The record holds. In the ledger's final accounting, Kursk demonstrated that wars are decided in factories as much as battlefields. Soviet industrial production, transportation capacity, and manpower reserves exceeded German equivalents sufficiently to absorb catastrophic losses and continue operations. This advantage, established before the battle and maintained throughout, determined the outcome. The human cost defies summary. Soviet families lost over 860,000 relatives during 3 months. German families lost over 200,000. Each number represents grief, absence, and permanent alteration of lives. Veterans carried physical and psychological wounds decades after. Children grew up without fathers. Communities lost entire cohorts of young men. Yet life continued. Karpov returned to mining, his hands unsteady but functional. Smirnova taught mathematics, her wartime service acknowledged but not discussed. Hoffmann recovered from wounds, resuming civilian work in Bavaria. Reiser repaired vehicles in Hamburg, memories unshared. Morozova welded steel in factories, her brother's photograph never removed from above her bed. The battlefield returned to agriculture. Farmers navigate around memorial sites. Tourists photograph monuments. The soil, fertilized by decomposition, grows crops that feed populations unaware of what lies beneath. Metal detectors occasionally find relics. Museums display them with placards listing dates and units. For historians, Kursk offers lessons in logistics, defensive doctrine, and industrial mobilization. For veterans, it represented endurance, loss, and survival through circumstances beyond full control. For families, it meant telegrams, absences, and altered futures. The memorial at Prokhorovka records names, but not stories. The archives preserve orders, but not conversations. The photographs show faces, but not thoughts. What remains are fragments. A diary entry, a letter home, a medical notation, a production ledger. These fragments, assembled across decades of research, reveal patterns. Industrial capacity determined replacement rates. Geographic depth enabled defensive flexibility. Manpower reserves sustained operations despite casualties. Tactical skill mattered less than systemic resilience. German planning assumed operational tempo would achieve breakthrough before Soviet reserves arrived. Soviet planning accepted attrition, trading casualties for time while positioning reserves beyond immediate reach. The mathematics favored depth over speed. By September 1943, the Eastern Front's character had changed permanently. German forces would mount no more strategic offensives. Soviet forces would advance, with pauses and setbacks, but continuous westward momentum. The arithmetic of replacement capacity dictated this trajectory. For participants, the significance emerged gradually. Karpov noted in a 1944 diary entry, "We advance, enemy retreats, pattern clear now." The realization came not from single battles, but accumulated experience across months. Each engagement demonstrated the same dynamic: German tactical proficiency versus Soviet material superiority, with outcomes determined by which factor mattered more in specific contexts. The answer, by late 1943, was clear. Material superiority, when combined with competent operational planning and willingness to accept casualties, overcame tactical excellence. The gap widened as Soviet commanders gained experience and German resources depleted. In May 1945, when Karpov's final diary entry noted silence after gunfire ceased, he had survived 4 years of war. His survival was neither earned nor guaranteed. Chance played its part throughout. He knew others more skilled, more careful, more deserving had not returned. This knowledge shaped his post-war silence on military service. The archival record contains no triumphant declarations from those who fought. Official histories emphasized victory. Personal accounts emphasized survival. The distinction reflects different perspectives, strategic success versus individual experience. For contemporary understanding, both perspectives matter. Strategic analysis reveals why outcomes occurred. Personal testimony reveals what those outcomes cost. Neither alone suffices. The files at TsAMO RF, the German Federal Archives, and other repositories remain accessible. Researchers continue extracting information, refining casualty estimates, and documenting equipment performance. Each study adds detail to the established narrative without fundamentally altering it. Kursk demonstrated that prepared defense absorbs offensive momentum when supported by adequate reserves. It showed that industrial output sustains operations longer than tactical brilliance. It proved that geographic depth provides strategic flexibility unavailable to smaller powers. And it confirmed, through accumulated casualties across both sides, that modern warfare's costs exceed any possible gain when measured in human terms. The strategic necessity recognized by commanders translated into personal catastrophe for hundreds of thousands. The balance sheet shows Soviet strategic victory achieved through acceptable losses within their capacity to sustain. German strategic defeat resulted from losses they could not replace. The arithmetic was brutal but clear. In 1943, that arithmetic determined the war's trajectory. The front would move west, through Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and into Germany. Soviet forces would pay for each kilometer with casualties. German forces would lack the capacity to reverse the advance. The pattern established at Kursk would repeat until May 1945. The costs would accumulate. The outcome was determined by summer 1943, though 2 years of fighting remained. Karpov's trembling hands, Smirnova's quiet classroom authority, Hoffman's permanent limp, Morozova's grief, these were the prices paid for strategic outcomes recorded in history books. The numbers documented victory and defeat. The individual costs remained largely private. The memorial walls list names, the archives preserve documents, the battlefields grow wheat. The veterans, nearly all deceased by the 21st century, carried memories they rarely shared. What remains are records, production figures, casualty lists, operational orders, and occasional diary entries. From these fragments, historians construct narratives. The narratives explain why events unfolded as documented, but they cannot fully convey what those events felt like to participants. The cold mud of April, the dust of July, the smoke of August, the silence of veterans decades later. These resist statistical representation. The record holds facts, memory holds experience. Both are necessary, neither alone is sufficient. Kursk ended as the documents record. Soviet forces advancing, German forces withdrawing, casualties mounting on both sides. The strategic turning point occurred not through dramatic reversal, but through accumulated attrition. One side could sustain and the other could not. For those who lived through it, the significance emerged slowly. For those who study it today, the significance appears clear in retrospect. The gap between experience and analysis defines all historical understanding. The files remain open. The names remain listed. The lessons remain available for those willing to examine evidence without romanticization. The war was decided by capacity, not courage, by production, not valor, by endurance, not brilliance. The participants knew this, though they rarely stated it plainly. The records confirm it, though they cannot capture the full cost. 70 years after Prokhorovka, The wheat still grows, the memorials still stand, the archives still hold the documents, the silence of those who fought remains the loudest testimony.